Hello, everybody. Terrence Lehue here with another episode of the Intellectual Agrarian podcast, where we talk philosophy from the farm. Our guest today is Jere Gettle. Dubbed the Indiana Jones of Seeds by the New York Times, he is the founder of Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds and has journeyed far and wide to obtain heritage and heirloom seeds. Jere started his first garden at age 3 and ever since wanted to be involved in the seed industry. At age 17, he mailed out the first Baker Creek Heirloom Seed Catalog. Today, it offers the largest selection of 19th century seeds available on the market. With his wife, Emilee, Jere has co-authored 2 books, the Heirloom Life Gardener and the Baker Creek Vegan Cookbook. Today, Jere will be sharing how and why he started Baker Creek, what heirloom means, the history of seeds, and much more. This was a fun discussion, and I hope you enjoy this episode with Jere Gettle. Jere Gettle, welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Sure appreciate it.
Now, starting off, would you mind sharing a brief biographical sketch with the audience?
I basically got interested in seeds from my grandparents and great-grandparents, and of course my aunts and uncles and parents. We grew up in a gardening family, gardening family in the Boise Valley area in Idaho and Oregon, right on the border, actually, and everybody around basically had gardens, so I kind of grew up in the garden. My first memories of looking at a publication was a seed catalog in the winter, sitting there in the winter dreaming about spring, and my earliest memories of being outside were in the garden, next to the summer squash plants, as tall as me, and just that was my first memories, as earliest memories were the insects and the squash and the tomatoes and flowers in the garden. So from there, my interest in gardening just kept increasing. And even at like 4 and 5 years old, I decided, someday I wanted to work for a seed company. And my interest in unusual varieties also, and ethnic and traditional varieties, started very young. It was like amazing. Here's a radish from China in the old Gurney's catalog, or here's a giant beet, giant mango beet, or a lemon cucumber. It was, right away fascinated me.
That's really cool. There is so much more variety, I think, than people know to a lot of varieties. I'm very fortunate. I'm an organic inspector, and so I get the opportunity to visit a lot of different farms that grow a lot of different seed varieties. And just some of these names, the heritage behind some of these seeds is absolutely fascinating.
The stories and the families that they come from and the countries they come from and regions and counties and cities. It's so much, in people's culture, whether it's in the U.S. or China or India or Europe, wherever they come from. And then it's interesting to see how the seeds travel and reconnect with different populations and then sometimes come back to those populations, 100 years later. And sometimes they change slightly over time, and sometimes they're almost exactly the same as their ancestors. But it's just a fascinating the way seeds develop and change, as well as stay the same in many ways through different cultures and eras and centuries. It's amazing to be able to pass these things down and to receive them from the past.
I really want to dig into this topic a little bit more, but first I have to ask, how does a 17-year-old decide to start a seed company?
Well, it basically started as a hobby. I started out slaving and collecting seeds, trading seeds, both through Seed Savers Exchange and online. The internet was just coming out, pretty well in the, mid to late 90s. So it was kind of a great opportunity to connect with people all over the planet. And then also, I'd always wanted, even from a 5-year-old, I'd wanted to, somehow work for a seed company. And it just started becoming clearer as I got older that why not start selling our seeds and what I grew each year in my garden and see what happened. So I just decided to print a price list, and gradually, after a couple of years, it took off. And, every year it's grown ever since the beginning, it's grown a little every year. Some years a lot, some years a little, but that's basically how it started. It was just a hobby that I knew I wanted to work with seeds one way or the other.
That's incredible. And it's really exciting to hear that you had such a passion for it from such a young age. I think that oftentimes it seems today we have a lot of young people that don't necessarily know what they do or what they want to do. It's really cool to see, no pun intended, but the seeds of your future starting at such a young age.
Yeah, I think it was mostly because I grew up, well, multiple things. I was always curious with, I think, genetic diversity and the whole thing of like, here's a red grasshopper, here's a green grasshopper, just the differences in genetics. But then also, all the connections with peoples and cultures and families, and the whole story of how seeds. I think that's what fascinated me to it. And growing up in a family with everybody gardening, I got to basically, those early years, I got to see a lot of different gardens and, spent a lot of time gardening. So I think it just kind of was second nature.
Now, the New York Times called you the Indiana Jones of seeds, which I think is so cool because, besides being an Indiana Jones fan, I love how it really brings to light the historical significance of some of these seeds, the cultural significance of some of these seeds. Would you mind sharing a little bit about some of the travels or the locations that some of these seeds come from?
Oh, it's just there's so many different stories and so many different trips. It's hard to know where to begin. But for example, here's an interesting seed. It's the Yokohama Squash, and this didn't come directly from my travels, but it came from a Mr. Burr in the 1860s. President Lincoln sent him to Japan as when Japan opened up finally after all the several centuries. Japan, but his brother was a seedsman and plant seller in New York, so he started sending things back, among which were like the hosta plants, which are everywhere today. Everybody has hosta plants in their yard or garden, but he sent so many different Japanese things back, but one of them was the Yokohama Squash, which was popular in the U.S. catalogs. It was probably in 15 or 20 catalogs in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and then it disappeared. And I just read about it in old catalogs, and I started searching around and finally found a gentleman in France that had the seed. I got some seed from this gentleman who'd kept it alive which had been kept alive in France, ordered it here in the U.S., and we'd been growing it here and offering it for the last 15 years or 20 years. And then I was wondering if it was still in Japan. So about 2 years ago, we finally got to take a trip to Japan, and we searched a lot of different seed companies and visited any company that was selling heirloom seeds still in Japan. And nobody had seen it. So it was exciting after 160 years to take it back, and they would get online and show us what they think might be the descendants of this squash, which don't look the same anymore, but they look somewhat similar. So they believe that this squash doesn't exist in Japan anymore. So that's kind of that's the kind of fun stuff we get to do on a day-to-day basis. And then also for another many cases of people coming to our store and finding something they can remember as a child, like maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, and they haven't been able to find since. And that's always fun. We've had people from Japan to people who are just local neighbors here, to people from, China or India or many different places that have not seen something in many years, and it's always fun to reconnect people. And whether we're here in the U.S. or we're traveling, we're always connecting people not only to our seeds, but sometimes even their seeds. So that's kind of what we do.
That is incredible. Again, just the sheer history behind some of these seeds is amazing. The fact that that particular variety of squash wasn't even in Japan anymore, it just boggles my mind. I love the stories behind it. And
there's so many fascinating stories. Everywhere we go, when you're into the seeds, there's always somebody. I visited my aunt and uncle in Oregon a few years ago, and there was a neighbor who had a melon that he'd been growing for almost 40 years, and he'd been selecting it. It's the sweetest melon. He grew many melons, but he was selecting this variety as the sweetest melon. It's called Tommy Apple Melon. We named it after the gentleman. But it originally was an Asian type of a melon, but he'd been selecting it. It had probably been crossed at one time, but he'd been selecting it for 40 years, and it was, the best tasting melon we've ever tasted as far as sugar content goes, just really sweet. And, that's one example here in the U.S., but then, as you travel, when we're in Taiwan, we found a white bitter melon. And, when we're in China this year, we were really excited to bring home a bright pink celery. Actually, not this year. We didn't bring it home. It was a year and a half ago now almost. But anyway, we brought this pink celery home, and it has just bright pink stems and totally like anything we'd ever seen before. So it's just, everywhere we go, we're always trying to find not only vegetables with interesting stories, but also vegetables that have interesting colors. And, these colors also represent, nutrient values. So that's kind of our goal, is finding the most nutrient-dense, most colorful, and most historic vegetables, that we can find. And most diverse, of course.
That is amazing. That just, again, truly amazing, because really what it is the seeds carry along a part of the culture with it. Food and the culture are kind of intertwined in ways we don't appreciate, but it really does start with, in livestock, the breeds, in seeds, the actual seed varieties themselves. Because with it, like in the example of the melons, it's growing in that one location for so long that it develops its own unique variety to itself. Now, you guys have its own unique variety now. It boggles the mind. Now, I do have to, since we're going to be discussing heirloom here, what is a rough definition of heirloom varieties for people that may not be as familiar with the term?
An heirloom seed is kind of open to interpretation, just like the word antique or vintage. But in general, it's a variety that's, been passed down from generation to generation. And how long that has to be, is, open to interpretation. There's varieties, that are becoming heirlooms that are basically new heirlooms that, somebody has developed, maybe 30 years ago, which maybe aren't old enough to be defined as an heirloom. And then there's other varieties, that have been around hundreds of years. And some cases, there's varieties, in a few cases, potentially even 2,000 years ago. Although, sometimes we don't know exactly at that state if it's the actual variety or not, but very similar strains have been, documented. But up to about 400 or 500 years ago, we had really good documentation on, quite a few varieties, and especially in the last, couple centuries, there's many, many varieties that are documented. So as far as how old it is, that's open to interpretation. But, some people say 50 years, but, it's kind of it's kind of open to your interpretation, but it's basically an open pollinated variety that's not hybrid. It's a variety that you can save every year and it'll come true, to its parent.
Okay. Again, my background actually is in livestock. I grew up on an organic belted Galloway farm. And so early on, I had an appreciation for the uniqueness of a variety of something. And we, in livestock world, keep distinct breeding records for the heritage of a particular strain of cattle. I think it's really neat that seeds can be the same way. How can other people get involved in helping to preserve the identity of some of these seeds? Because it seems like something that maybe gets forgotten from time to time.
Yeah, basically there's multiple ways you can do it, but one thing to do is even if you just adopt one seed, whether it's something in your local community or something that your neighbor gives you or something you find on a trip or something that's just special to you really like and just keep growing it every year. That's one thing, that's the easiest thing. Almost everybody could, if they have a garden, could save at least a few things in their garden and then pass them on to others in your community, give them to your local seed bank. If you have extra seeds, share them with your neighbors. You can always trade them at the local garden club and there's also seed swaps. If you get into, seed saving in a bigger way, you can always take your seeds to a seed swap and exchange seeds with other people. I get new seeds to try out each year. That's there's lots of ways to get connected, but, just start saving some seeds. It's really easy, and it'll keep especially local varieties in your area. Find some local varieties and keep them going.
Now, I'm just a little curious here. What are some of the steps people need to do to save a seed? Is it as simple as opening the plant and taking the seeds out, or is there more to it?
In general, that's pretty much it. There's a few things to know, though. If you have different varieties of some crops, they cross really easily, especially depending on when they're growing. But say you have two varieties of corn growing next to each other, most likely you're going to get some of the kernels that cross. So in some cases, you can only really grow one crop in your garden of that type in order, like one tomato. But if you have a few feet, tomatoes really don't take a lot of isolation. So even sometimes side by side, they're fine. But, if they're 20 feet away, usually you're okay. Other things like corn, they might need a mile or so away to make sure you're safe. So there is some to get to know. But to start out with, you can always just start saving seed, planting it. If you make a few mistakes along the way and get a few ears of corn that are a different color, it's not going to be, it's not going to be the end of the world. You can basically learn seed saving from your neighbors, your friends, garden clubs, whoever is doing it already, but also just practice on your own. See how it goes, see how it crosses, see how far things need to be apart in your own area. For a home gardener. Especially at first, and then as you get better, then hopefully eventually you'll be able to keep these varieties pure and true. But the biggest thing is learning which things cross and which things don't. That's the main thing.
I have to say my favorite soundbite from this entire conversation so far is adopt a seed. It's a really great way of thinking about it because it's taking ownership of something. And there are a lot of, like, I always love looking at the different names of these varieties. And in some of these varieties, the names reflect the people that cared for them. Like the one gentleman with the melons, Tommy Melon, was it called?
Yeah, Tommy Apple Melon.
Tommy Apple Melon.
So that one, yeah, that one was named after the gentleman that we got the seed from. Sometimes we name it after. It kind of depends on that's what their family had called it. So we usually choose the name. The closest name that makes the most sense to the location or person where it came from, if it's an unnamed variety. A lot of times varieties already have a name, but sometimes it's just a name they've been calling it, and it kind of sticks after a while.
Mm-hmm. Again, I just think it's an interesting way of seeing how the cultural history of something continues with the seed itself.
That helps preserve the stories along with it, and keeping his story with the seed, I think, is important. And that's what we try to do with all of our seeds as we find them. Unfortunately, a lot of times, the story of the founder or the originator of the seed has kind of been lost in in time. But fortunately, quite a few varieties still have stories that are attached.
This is kind of more of a side question, but have you guys ever thought about putting together a collection of some of the stories of the seeds?
We've thought about it, we've tried to do it through, like our whole seed catalog and, different MAC publications and stuff, but we haven't we've thought about doing more of a thorough, we've been doing more and more online, and we're also working on YouTube videos right now that tell a little bit more of each story of each seed. We're just starting that process. We probably have about 20 videos up so far. But in time, we'd love to produce a publication that tells, more of the story and background on more of the seeds.
That's fantastic. I'm definitely checking those videos out, and anyone listening should also. Now, when you get a seed from a different location, are there any particular, so you've made specific travels out to China to get some seeds, for example. Are there any special permits that you need, or was it take to get a seed in and out of a country?
Well, into the U.S., it depends. Generally, though, what is required in most cases is getting a phytosanitary certificate. And so you can on the country is the difficulty of getting that can vary. Usually we work with like a seed company or an organization in the country to get the phytosanitary, and then they just ship it back to us. So that's usually what's required. Sometimes you can get a small lots permit also and bring the seeds in like packaged seed without a phytosanitary certificate. And then, a lot of people, though, just bring the seeds on their persons or ship them back in the mail. And in general, the inspectors, it varies. But in general, I would say the way most seeds come into this country come the same way they've always come with, immigrants or travelers who just ate a tomato and saved a few seeds out of it and brought it back. So it's not necessarily the totally legal way, but that's how most seeds have traveled, for centuries. It's still people just grab a few seeds out of a tomato or whatever, and it just travels with the people. Immigrants coming here from Poland or wherever, for centuries, that's how most of our seeds have arrived. Good or bad, that's how, generally what happens.
I was reading your book, The Heirloom Life Gardener, and I found it really interesting that in Italy, the tomato was brought in from another country. And again, I just think it's really interesting to see some of the stories of these seeds that we'd naturally associate with one place. It actually has a deeper heritage to somewhere else.
Yeah, so many things have become, kind of icons of the country or their food. But, a few hundred years ago, like Thailand, a few hundred years ago, maybe 400 years ago, the chili pepper really didn't exist there. So now, Thailand, the chili pepper is everything to their food. And in so many places, it's the tomato for, Italian food has become iconic. But, a few hundred years ago, they didn't, 400 or 500 years ago, they really didn't have the tomato. So it's like totally reshaped their food culture, probably almost more than anything else in Italy, besides maybe wheat, is, tomato.
That's incredible to think of. Now, speaking of food culture here, I'm curious, what does it take for you guys to say this is a seed we need to carry? Because you said a little bit about running some trials before.
It's difficult to figure out what we want to carry every year because there's so many different seeds. It's a lot of work, trialing, researching, getting information, but and there's so much available. So basically, what we look for every year is finding the things that are the most unique. Of course, we're looking for stories, colorful vegetables, flowers, fruits, herbs, and also things that taste great, things that just look amazing and grow amazing. Ideally we're trying to find those amazing crops that do great, produce well, taste good, and look and have amazing stories. In some cases they don't have all of that, but our number one goal is to find as many of those that we can that are, just out of circulation, but should be, that should be in the general public, but have somehow disappeared or never got popular. So, for example, the pink celery is a great example. Why don't we have pink celery, or why don't we have, purple cauliflower or purple carrots? Why aren't these things, common? Or the red buckwheat, why aren't we growing red buckwheat in this country? So we're always looking for new, not necessarily new things, but new to America, or new to, in a lot of cases, new to the whole, the whole culinary scene, not just in America. A lot of times these things like pink celery, for example, even in China, is mostly just growing for restaurants right around Beijing. It's not really known a whole lot out of Beijing, other than a few, home gardeners and a few people might grow it for a few restaurants, but it's very, it's not something you see in grocery stores. And that's the way most of these varieties are. They should be, commonly available, but just people don't know about them. They're just used to white celery, so that's just kind of what stays on the table, or orange carrots,
Mm-hmm.
But, fortunately, a lot of these colors are starting to show up more and more, at farmers markets and so forth.
Yeah, I actually used to work at farmers markets quite a bit. And that was one of the things I loved, was when I got to see the multiple different colors, the new different varieties. And in part, my work there was with an apple orchard. And part of the great thing about apples is obviously, just like all the other seeds, there are just thousands of different varieties that you can grow. And I was always amazed at the people that didn't know there were more than Golden Delicious, Red Delicious, and Honeycrisp. Because there's just such a wealth of flavor out there. Even in just looking at the narrow spectrum of apples, there are such sorry, I go on about apples.
It's amazing. It's amazing all the diversity in apples and pears and apricots. Just every one of these crops, whether you take eggplants or even something that seems for the average person boring, like potatoes. Most people think a potato is a potato, but when you start looking into it, an apple or a potato, it's way more than what, most people think an apple has white flesh and red skin, and they all taste about the same, but it's totally, and the same with potatoes. All these crops have so much diversity and flavors and stories that, totally need to be brought out and, reintroduced or introduced for the first time.
Among the many facets of your operation is Bakersville, a pioneer village that's a part of the main headquarters, which I thought was so cool. Can you tell me a little bit about what made you decide to start this?
Well, me and my wife had always been interested, right after we got married, we'd always been interested in history and going to historic places. So we decided to start putting in, we had the seed store in and a couple of outbuildings. So we started putting in different things. We put in some pens for heritage chickens and some other animals that are, just for display. And we started putting in some gardens, and we thought, why not put in, a restaurant? And we put in the little blacksmith shop and a music barn and so forth and so forth. So when we have our festivals here, there's a little bit more for people to do. There's a little bit of place for people to get out of the weather if it's raining. And also just day to day when people come out, there's a little more for them to do as they go shop through there's a few other little side shops, as well as, of course, the gardens and the poultry and miniature horses and donkey and sheep and peacocks and so forth. So it gives people kind of a place to come and see not only the gardening, but also kind of a little taste of what, life was like before, everything became connected to a iPhone or a television. Kind of take people back a little bit to where they can come out and spend the day basically on the farm and have a picnic lunch and walk through the gardens or greenhouses and, basically get a little bit of farm life and what society was like before everything became globalized as far as the economy.
I think that's incredible. It's the moment I heard about it, I'm like, I have to go visit this at some point. It sounds amazing. And again, if I remember correctly, you're close to Laura Ingalls Wilder country too, aren't you?
We are, yeah. We're only like 5 miles from the Laura Ingalls Wilder house, so it's we're right in that same neighborhood. And we oftentimes get a lot of people that are visiting the Wilder house will visit here, or vice versa. A lot of people that come to the festival, of course, stop in at the Wilder house here in Mansfield. So we're right near Springfield, Missouri, southern Missouri, Springfield, Branson area. We're about an hour or so away from both of those. So just get a lot of people that stop that are traveling through to different locations. We're kind of right in the middle of the country, so we do get a fair amount of tourists, especially in the warmer months.
That's definitely always a nice plus during the warmer months. Now, I kind of want to close this interview, which has been fantastic, with a question that I'm just curious. Do you have a favorite story to a seed or a favorite variety? I know all the ones you grow.
Yeah.
Narrow it down.
Yeah, that's really hard. I mean, there's so many great stories. I'm trying to think of what my favorite would be. Probably, well, I can't say a number one favorite. There's just too many. I mean, each category, I love so many of them. But one of the stories that I probably, at least for our company, has been connected, at least clear from the beginning, is the Alibaba watermelon. And there was a gentleman from Iraq who it was probably been like 97. We started to write to him. And at that time, I believe he was living in Iraq. He'd moved out and moved to London, 4 or 5 years later, I believe. And he might have lived in Turkey for a year or two. But anyway, he started sending us seeds. And one of the first things he sent us was the Alibaba watermelon. And he said, this is an old variety from Iraq. We call it Alibaba watermelon. And he said, since the war started going on in Iraq, he actually sent it to us, I believe, in between the wars. Yeah, it was in between the wars, because that was the 90s. So it was after the first Iraqi war. But he said since the war, the first Iraqi war, America had introduced a lot of new seeds, and a lot of farmers had switched over to growing, hybridized varieties. They were losing their traditional varieties at a really big pace. So he sent me that letter, and that was before the second Iraqi war. Like, when did that happen? 2001, 2002, 3, and there. So this was like 97 or 98, somewhere in there. And this variety, when we grew it, it did better than any of our other varieties at that time, and it also tasted the sweetest watermelon, most flavorful watermelon, and also keeps better than about any other watermelon we had. So we were really excited to get it into the catalog, and our customers loved it. Dr. Amy Goldman featured it in her Melons for the Passionate Grower as the best tasting watermelon. And so from there, it basically has become one of our top-selling watermelons year in and year out for the last 20 years. And over the years since then, this gentleman, we haven't heard from him for a number of years, so I don't know, where he's at or what's up with him. But anyway, probably in about 2005, we got another little batch of seed from him, as well as a letter saying that he was living in London now with some relatives and that he couldn't garden anymore. Here's some more seeds. He said that the situation, after the Second War, America had introduced a whole lot more hybrids from the Second War, and the traditional varieties were being discouraged. And here's some more seeds. Please keep them going for me, if you like them. And anyway, that was the last we'd heard from this gentleman. But it's just varieties like this, or varieties we've got from Syria also right before the war. A lot of these varieties, it could be a war, it could be multiple different things that could happen that make, countries lose varieties even quicker than they already were. And we try to keep these things, at least the best of them, we try to keep going, so in the future, if somebody wants them again, they can take them back to their culture, at some point in the future.
That's amazing. That's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing it with us. Jere, thank you for spending this time with us. Where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
Oh, the best place is, just rareseeds.com. You can also pick up one of our catalogs, the whole seed catalogs, at pretty much any major newsstand, and a lot of supermarkets have it too. So you can either buy it or you can just read it in the store, for that matter. And, of course, Facebook is, we have a lot of stuff on Facebook all the time. So you can find us under Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds on Facebook. So
thank you again, Jere, so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Big thanks to Jere for being on the show today. It was a pleasure to have him on the show and talk about the incredible history to some of these varieties. You can learn more about Jere and his work by checking out their website, rareseeds.com, and by following them on social media. All of this will be linked in the show notes. Thanks again for listening. If you're new to the show, please subscribe to the podcast in your podcast player of choice. We are available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, CastBox, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. While you are there, please be sure to leave a rating and review, letting others know how great the show is. This has been Terrence Lehue, and the Intellectual Agrarian podcast, reminding you to keep farming the dream.